Have you ever wondered if we can write equations to get depth or estimate other things from a camera? Can we write these physics equations that govern how light rays impinge on your sensor and how an image is captured? In the previous videos, we have seen this intuitively, but the question is, can we do the math for it? And can we use this math to give robots superpowers to compute things from an image which would otherwise be not possible? In today's episode, let's demystify camera models and let's go derive them. So before we dive right in, I want to take a moment to sort of give you an intuitive understanding of how important this thing is. So of course, some of you might be art connoisseurs in the viewers. I'm going to show you two paintings and I want you to pause the video and think for a second which of these paintings you would prefer and why. So the first one we have is a medieval painting. The painting is pretty good for medieval era. It's a beautiful painting. And we have another painting from the Renaissance era, which is, in this case, it's Pietro Perugino's painting. And if you look at both the paintings, I want you to sort of take a pick of which one you would prefer and pause and ponder for a second why you would prefer one over the other. And let me sort of preface this by saying that the image or the painting on the right is a much newer painting than the one on the left. So I would argue that most of you would have probably picked the painting on the right because it's more closer to what we would see as human beings. On the image on the left, you would see that the people, though some of the people are farther away, some of the people are closer, they're all approximately the same size. So it sort of messes up with the reality of scale as how we would see it in the real world. So in an ideality, what we see is the same size object, the farther away something is, you would see it to be smaller. And that's what you see in the Renaissance painting on the right hand side. And this is called perspective because it gives you a perspective of how far something is based on an intuitive understanding of the world. So just to recap, if there are two objects, one is farther away, you would see that object or it appears to be smaller in the image or in the painting, and that gives you a sense of depth and scale in the image. So image on the right, it gives you this layer of depth so that you walk into the painting and you can sort of imagine yourself the 3D structure of the scene. Image on the left is a lot more confusing to the human brain and it's much harder for us to understand actually where the depth lies and what is actually going on. Great. So the question is, like, in that era, it was really hard for somebody to paint these things in 3 dimensions. So what artists did, artists were really creative at that time. They came up with a device which basically would let them sort of, in some sense, instead of mathematically modeling these rays, basically mimic what one would do, like a carbon copy of what is in the real world. So imagine you would see something through an eyepiece and you would basically be able to put dots on a piece of paper which mimics what the real ray of light would have come across. Let me play a video and the video does explain it pretty well. So let's go through that.
It's shown by Albrecht Dürer is a device that consists of a stretcher that had movable threads along which are threaded movable beads. When an additional thread is pulled from the object point as far as the center of the projection plane, a bead is placed to mark where the thread meets said plane of the stretcher. If the side door bearing the sheet of paper is closed, then the point marked by the bead can be permanently traced, and, point after point, the image will be rebuilt with the utmost precision.
One of the coolest part about this kind of drawing would be that you can have this plane where the paper intersects the bead at any angle. So you could essentially paint or redraw this object of interest from any perspective, right? And you'd see that in this particular case, the musical instrument is basically horizontal, but you're actually painting it from the back or the front, right? Awesome. These images or paintings were called perspectographs because you could essentially take like a picture of a perspective, or you are basically tracing out the perspective of an object. Of course, this worked really well for things which are smaller, which could be placed on a table, but you couldn't really do this for something like a cityscape. So in today's episode, we are going to demystify and decipher the math that governs these equations, which were used centuries ago for people to draw cityscapes to absolute perfect scale. Okay, let me ask you another thought experiment. You're in your home, you have beautiful white walls, and you have a window which is open. The window is letting in light. The question is this a camera? Pause and ponder for a second and come back. The answer is yes, this is indeed a camera. Then the question is, where is the image formed? The image is technically formed on the wall opposite to where your window is, in this particular case the wall with the door handle. The question is, why can't you see it? The answer is very simple. It's too blurry and it's too bright. The image is technically there, right? But it's too blurry and too bright. So you just see a plain sort of blur. In this particular case, if you sort of clearly see it, it's a mixture of the sort of cream color of the wall plus the green color of the tree from the outside is what is the color of light you see inside. Beautiful. And this is sort of you would see this every single day, and it's sort of intuitive because if there is a red color car outside, you'd see a red color cast on your window, on your wall, right? So the question is now, if I wanted to create a sharper image from this, how would I do that? So one thing what you can do is you can basically pull up your blinds where only light from a small opening is actually falling on the wall, like you see on the image on the top right there. And depending on that, now you can sort of see a clearer image, but note that it would be upside down in this case. And this is indeed a camera. And this is exactly what people built in the olden days. This what we just built is called a camera obscura. It means dark chamber in Latin. If you ever visit San Francisco, there is a big camera, like a building sized camera obscura, where you can actually go in and see the image of the ocean. So the coolest part about this camera obscura is people built this camera obscuras for whatever they wanted to paint, and they would painstakingly trace out every single detail of that and paint the details in. And this is how people could actually get the full three-dimensional structure of the scene super accurate for a very large scene. And this camera obscura is beautiful, and this is what you would see in San Francisco. I'm going to pause and ask a question. Why is this curved? Why does it look like it's distorted? The answer is actually fairly simple, because this image was taken from a GoPro. The actual walls are actually very big. So to fit that in, you actually have a lot of distortion, which you see something like this. So you might be wondering, hey, I live really far away from San Francisco, but I want to have an experience of my camera obscura. What can I do, right? All you need is a shoebox and some baking paper or a parchment paper. What you can do is you can basically take a shoebox, cut a hole on one end, and just put a parchment paper on the other, and you can move this thing around, and at one point you will actually see the image being formed fairly clearly. Of course, I would also recommend closing the box on the top and just have an opening on the other side for your eyes to see. Your image is going to look a lot more crisper and sharper and contrasty. What we just built is something like this. You have a dark chamber, which is the shoebox equivalent. You have your eyepiece, wherein the hole, in this case the top of the box, and you have another hole, which is we call a pinhole because it's supposed to be a very small hole made with the head of a pin, where the light from the data actually enters. In this case, we have Gompe the goat, which is basically being imaged by the camera. Beautiful. So in the olden days, what you could do is you could take this camera obscura, you could stick a negative film where the parchment paper is, and you could keep this camera shutter open for a couple of minutes, and you could actually go develop this photograph. And essentially just the cost of the film and just a couple of shoe boxes, you can create your own camera. Of course, the images are not the best in the world. They're not as sharp as you would want, but it still works great. It's amazing, right? So the question is, why do we not use these things today? This is called the pinhole camera or the pinhole model. So what are the issues with this stuff? The problem is, remember that we made the part of the opening where the light enters the camera very small. It's like a pinhole. So there is too little light. So the problem is that for you to actually capture an image of not a super bright sunny scene, you need like minutes to hours of data to actually collect, like where in minutes to hours of exposure time for the film needs to be there for you to actually capture an image which is actually reasonable. So of course you can't capture low light scenes. If there are things which are in motion, which is not a perfectly static scene, like remember in olden days where paintings and photographs were made, people would do like still life photography where things were fixed, like these fruits in a basket and things like that. It works really well for that. But if it's a dancing ballerina or something like that, it has a lot of motion and it's a lot of motion blur. So you would just basically get a blurry mess. And it's actually really hard to focus because you have to physically move the plane of the sensor, or in this case the parchment paper or the thing from your like film. It's really bad. So the problem also is that, remember that we said the hole has to be like a pinhole. The larger the pinhole, the blurrier it gets, right? And it gets really bad. In a sense, size does matter when it comes to the diameter of a pinhole. Let's look at a simple example. In this particular case, on the bottom number, you see the diameter of the pinhole itself. As you would see from going from left to right, the sharpness changes pretty significantly as your size of the pinhole changes. So let's do a beautiful plot of sharpness versus opening size. You'd see that it sort of looks like a Gaussian distribution. It's not necessarily a perfectly a Gaussian distribution, but it looks like it has one beautiful peak. And the goal for us is to find where that peak is, which is the maximum sharpness and what's the diameter of that opening for that. So it's blurry on the left hand side where the opening is really large. And I'm going to ask you the question, why is that? So what happens is light is a wave. So you have diffraction. So you have like light from different points being blurred onto a single pixel or a part of the film. So you will basically have diffraction and light is going to become blurry, right? Great. So, and the ideal pinhole size can be found as this formula, where this is the ideal pinhole diameter, and you basically have a function of focal length and the wavelength itself. Beautiful. So another thing is, we would see that like if we make the pinhole super small, you will basically see diffraction patterns which look like this, which is not necessarily a single point of light, but you will actually see a function like this. If you have seen Fourier transforms and things like that from the previous video, if not, I would urge you to watch it. You would sort of notice what this equation is. Recall that the Fourier transform of a direct delta function is a sinc function. So you actually see a decaying sinusoidal waveform modulated by the scale of x. The question also is like, why is it blurry on the blue side? Like why on the right hand side, right? The smaller we get, it should get better, right? The problem is that light from different points superimpose on the same point. So what is happening here is like, as your pinhole gets smaller and smaller, your light wave is essentially interfering with the pinhole diameter itself. So light is going to have a constructive and destructive superimposition. So you are actually going to have a blurry image on the right hand side as well. So there is an optimal parameter. In this particular case, it's 0.35 millimeters as the opening, depending on the focal length of what you want and depending on the wavelength of light. Of course, you would wonder that if it's a color image, how does this work? Remember, this only works for a single color of the light. So what people would do is, if they want to like image a color scene, they would just pick the green because it's somewhere in the middle and sort of get away with like a little more blurriness on the red and blue sides. So the question is, how do we fix this, right? The answer is fairly simple. We need to focus light. Remember, with a pinhole, there was technically no focusing. We sort of relied on the physics of light waves, or like the way the wavefronts interact with a small pinhole. analogous to the young double slit experiment from physics. And we were like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna call it a day and move on in my life. Problem is, if you want a really sharp image and you actually want a good amount of light, that's not that great, right? So to focus light, what we are going to do is we are actually going to use a piece of glass with a diffractive index greater than what you would find in air. Okay, so let's place an object on the right hand side. It has a height of O, and you'll have rays which pass through the lens, they get bent, and they will form and they will converge at a point on the image plane, in this case I, right? And this is the image size I. Remember that the object size and the image size are physically different because the image sensor is much smaller than the physical object. So of course the ray which passes through the center of the lens would basically pass directly through without any bending. So we'll also have a few more things which we call the distance from the lens to the object is called the scene depth O, and the distance from the image sensor to the lens is called the imaging distance I. Remember that the scene depth generally is in meters, so it's pretty far away. The imaging distance is really small, it's generally in millimeters. And because that's your size of the camera is in few millimeters, right? It's not like the size of a room, and that's the idea here. So another thing which I want to point out is like how much of these rays bend depends on the lens intrinsic property itself, and that is essentially the focal length. The focal length is basically how much, intuitively if you want to think about it, how much you can zoom in, right? Like how much you see. In essence, if I flip the script around and say, hey, it's more about how much light can I bend so that you can see more field of view, right? And that's what the lens's bending power is denoted by focal length f. If you have ever gotten prescription glasses, they basically specify these numbers, right? They do it in diopters, but this is the equivalent of that for us. That's what we're talking about. And in high school physics, you would have seen equations like this, where you have like the relationship between imaging distance, the scene depth, and the focal length. This is called the Gaussian lens law or the thin lens model. The assumption we are making here is that the lens is infinitely long, like super big, right? Like infinitely big, and it's infinitely thin. So we don't really care too much about what happens inside the lens. So we can approximate it with an equation like this. So, and we assume that the lens is a beautiful homogeneous medium with the same refractive index all through. So essentially this equation, if you want to interpret this in a more intuitive manner, it tells you how far you need to set the lens for the image to be focused, right? So what is the distance between the image and the lens which I need to set, or how far do I need to be from the object for the image to be in focus and sharp. So where rays only meet in one point for that plane. So if you wanted to find the focal length of an image or a lens, the old fashioned way, what you would do is you would take the lens, you would basically focus it at take the rays of the sun, and you would like move the lens back and forth, and where you would see the smallest dot. Of course, remember that you don't want to look at the sun like this because you're going to burn through your eyeballs, because this point gets extremely hot. If you're ever stuck in a campground and you have a lens lying around with you, this is a simple way to make fire, right? Because that point gets extremely hot. So there's a temple in the state I come from, Karnataka, in Sringeri. So in Sringeri, they actually cook food using solar rays just like this. They use a lens to heat up a kettle of water, which essentially turns into steam, and which essentially becomes the cooking heat method for the food that is served in that temple, which is very cool. Awesome. So what did we do here mathematically? We basically said, hey, we have this equation 1 by I plus 1 by O is equal to 1 by F. Because remember, sun is really far away, you can basically say that the object distance is infinity compared to everything else, right? So 1 by infinity is 0. So your distance now to the image sensor, in this case the piece of paper, will essentially become your image, your focal length. And that's what we did. Beautiful. So let's go back to the slides from before. Remember that we know that these two triangles which are shaded in yellow, the thing on the side of the object and the thing on the side of the image, they're both similar triangles. And remember that I told you that the object height HO, which is like the actual thing which is generally in meters, is not necessarily the same size as the imaging distance or imaging height, right? Like the size of the image on the sensor itself. So this is called the magnification factor, which basically we define as the ratio of the object height or object size to the image height or image size. So remember that you can have more than one lens because you might want to like correct for issues with different amounts of bending in different amounts of light, or you might want to like have some desirable properties at the edges of the lens, because in theory we assume that the lens is infinitely large, but in practice it's not. So you actually have to compensate for this with more lenses. You can apply the same Gaussian lens law multiple times. One thing what you would do is you would basically consider the thing at the output or the left hand side of each of the lens, and you would call that the intermediate image, right? And you will get the magnification the same way. You just keep multiplying the magnification due to each of the lenses. Great. In practice, I just want to like quickly reiterate, each of these like complex lenses like you buy from Nikon or Sony or Canon actually have a lot of lens elements. They have like 9 to 15 lens elements in each of the lenses. They bend lights in very different ways, and there are light simulation sort of tools you can get online. You can buy these tools, like they're really expensive to make it accurately, and you can actually get this so that you can image colors in a different way. Remember, we talked about Bayer pattern. If you haven't watched that video, I would link it up, so you should watch that video. You have like pixels which are like neighboring pixels capture red, green and blue light. You actually have to bend the amount of red, green and blue light in a particular specific way where it impinges perfectly on this part of the sensor. And so that's what these lens elements actually do for us. Beautiful. So again, just to recap, so these lenses get expensive and they actually have a lot of elements, and they have like different kinds of coatings to reduce different kind of distortion effects. And it's actually really complicated, and it's an art and a science to craft high quality lenses, and that's why they're generally really expensive. Okay, great. So now in practice what happens is we also want to control the amount of light that is there in the sensor. So the way we would do that is essentially we would put something called an aperture. So this aperture is essentially like, imagine like a pupil, like what we have. Your pupils get like really wide open at night, so they turn a lot of light. And if you're looking at the sun, the pupils get really small. The opening in your eye gets really small to reduce the amount of light. An aperture is exactly the same thing which we do. You might have seen when you go to buy a lens, oh yeah, there is something called f2.8. And we did talk about this like when we were talking about imaging sensors in one of the first videos. If you don't remember that, I would urge you to go watch that. So this aperture is basically that plate. So now what happens is, of course, when the plane is in focus, we have this thing in beautiful focus. But when you have a point which is outside the plane of focus, you will see that this becomes not a single point, but a circle on the image plane called the blur circle. Again, in this example, we are imaging a single point of light. Imagine like a laser pointer or an LED shining, and that's what we are imaging. And if it's in focus, you will see that as a small dot, like maybe a pixel or 2 pixels. But if it's actually out of the plane of focus, which means that in this example, it's farther away than the plane of focus, what will happen is you will actually see that as a beautiful blurry circle. So you would, to extract the equations out of this, you would do the same thing as the Gaussian lens law we saw before. You just apply it twice and do the similar triangles. When you do that, you'll see that the blur circle B is going to be given by this equation. Okay, notice that here only one plane in the world is in focus at all times. And I'm going to repeat that one more time. So whenever you set focus, you're setting a focus to a world distance at that planar distance. Imagine you set focus at 1 meter. Everything in the plane at 1 meter is going to be at focus. Anything that is at 0.99 is out of focus. Anything that is at 1.01 is out of focus. But the question is the amount of defocus the same between 1.01 and 1.5 meters? The answer is no. the farther away you get from the plane of focus, the more blurrier it's going to get, or the lesser the sharpness is going to get. So the question is then, we take pictures which are fairly sharp, right, with our smartphones. How do we achieve that? What I'm telling you here is that there's only one plane in focus, but we see pictures, we zoom in, we pixel peep, they look fairly good. How does that even work? How does that even make sense, right? So what happens is, we say, oh, hey, like anything that is acceptably sharp, visually we cannot notice that it's blurred out. We are good with that, right? And basically, by changing the aperture, you can make this sharpness curve flat. And this concept is called depth of field. And I'll show you a couple of examples in a second. But just to recap, so your world plane, when you set focus, there's only one plane in the world which is at absolute focus. As you go farther away from that world plane point, either in either direction, closer to the camera or farther away from the camera, you're actually going to start losing sharpness. And when we take a picture, we say like whatever looks acceptably sharp is good for us, and that is going to be called the depth of field of that setup. Okay, so as you change aperture, depth of field does change. In this particular example, f3.5 is basically a wide open aperture. Example like your pupil is completely open at night. So your focus is in this case on the leaf in the front. So you'll see that the background is really blurred out because it's really far away. As you stop down, which is like close in the aperture, like you would do it in the daylight, like in this case, the bottommost image, f22, you'd see that the background comes more in focus. Of course, in this particular case, the background is not perfectly in focus, but it's acceptably sharp enough for us to realize what is there. We can identify the bench, we can identify the building in the back, we can identify the individual leaves of the tree. Right? And by changing the shape of the aperture, you can essentially get different kinds of shapes of blur. In this particular case, like these are like fairy lights on the back of this like love board, wherein they are blurred out to be beautiful hearts. That is simply because the shape of the aperture in this particular case was the heart. If the shape of the aperture is circular, you would see this as like circular bokeh balls, as what we would call in photography. Beautiful. Let's zoom in more to these two extreme images, f3.5 and f22. And let's look at the part which is in focus and which is technically more out of focus. And this is what it would look like, right? And you can clearly see the amount of defocus difference between f3.5 and f22. Okay, when you take pictures in the world, the question is, how is everything in focus? So there are two ways. One is, like I said, like you stop down your aperture so much that like everything is acceptably sharp. In practice, spoiler alert, nothing is truly always perfectly in focus. Right? It's acceptably sharp, it's acceptably in focus. What I'm going to show you next is a little snippet where we are going to play with an online DOF simulator. So what is going to happen is you will see that there is something called the hyperfocal distance, which is if you set focus at this distance, everything from this to that distance onwards to infinity is going to be in absolute sharp enough region that it is in focus for us to do whatever we want. Here I have this beautiful website called the DOF simulator from Michael Bemowski, which is absolutely free. I would urge you to go and play with this to get an intuitive idea of what we were just talking about. So what I'll do here is I'm just going to pick a 1.7 meter model, which is like the person of interest we are going to focus on. You can change the focal length here, and I'm going to just select a full frame camera because it's easier to discuss with that, right? So with a full frame camera, I'm going to basically say like we are at 50 millimeters focal length, which is what a human eye would see. And if I focus at about, let's say 4 meters, right? You'll see that the depth of field is fairly small, which is basically the person is in focus, but everything in the background is fairly blurred out. This is nice and beautiful bokeh. As I keep dropping the F number, you'll see that the blur is more, which is more the aperture is open, the more the blur of the background is. And of course, the closer I bring the model, the more blur on the background you will see as well. Right? We can flip the entire thing around, we can push the model farther away, but we can also zoom in to the person. We will effectively get the same thing. See, when you want to take a beautiful picture of your partner or of your friend, what you want to do is you actually want to like counterintuitively push them far away and have a lot of distance between them and the background, and you go really back and actually zoom in on their face. So if you're trying to take this beautiful flattering picture where the background is beautifully out of focus, on your phone, go back, take a couple of steps back, get those steps counted, and hit that 2x or 3x button and zoom into their face. It looks much more appealing than what you would do when you get closer to them, right? Another thing which I also want you to notice, let's go back to 50 millimeters where we were, which is the human focal length, and let's go to something like f8, right? So at f8 you would see that on the front of the model, basically the thing in this gray zone is everything that is in focus, right? You'll see that the part in the front there's lesser part in the front which is in focus than the lesser part in the back. But as I start pushing this f number more and more, you'll see that up to infinity everything is in focus now. If I set focus at a distance greater than this thing called the hyperfocal distance, which is in this particular case 4.3 meters, so I've set it at 11, everything is going to be tack sharp in the image, and that's how we capture images which appear to be tack sharp. Remember that it's never perfectly in focus, but it's acceptably sharp enough for us to have that. Okay, let's do one more thing. So you can go to 300 millimeters, you can go to f1, and let's bring the model closer. You'll see that the depth of field is so small in this particular case. I broke that, give me a sec. Yeah, so the depth of field is so small in this particular case, only the eyes of the person are in focus, even the nose because it's a little more closer, and the mouth which is like not in the same plane as the eyes, and the ears which are farther away and the eyebrows which are farther away are already out of focus. The hair is out of focus, right? So you can have like razor tack sharp depth of field, and remember you can use this in robotics to do some really cool stuff. Okay, so let's take a side step from our storyline, and let's just talk about focusing. So when you have an image which is not perfectly sharp, this is what it would look like. You have the blur circle. One way to get it in focus is you move the image sensor itself, wherein you move the image sensor back so it gets back in focus. The other way to do that is basically you move the lens assembly, so the way the light rays bend with respect to your image plane changes and it gets in focus. Another way is you basically move both of them appropriately enough that you basically get the image in focus. Great. So when I wrote the thin lens model, I made a bunch of assumptions, right, implicitly. So I just want you to take a step and realize what are the assumptions we made. So one of the assumptions we made was we said, hey, like we don't really care about depth of field too much when we do the thin lens model. So we have a tiny enough aperture for acceptable sharpness, and we have enough light for a good shutter speed, and we approximated multiple lenses as a thin lens model. And also one more thing I want you to understand is that this is the thin lens model which we used in tandem with the pinhole model. So that's how we got basically infinite depth of field. We got a super small aperture for perfect sharpness, and we assume that, remember, like with a pinhole sort of model where the aperture is really small, you need a lot of light. We assume that there's a lot of light. And remember that technically you have multiple lenses in a lens assembly, but we assume that it can be modeled beautifully with a single lens. Did you notice something really cool about this stuff? The blur circle B is actually proportional to the scene depth, which is super cool, right? Can you come up with some amazing ideas to utilize this in robotics? Remember, this is embodied intelligence, so we have to really think about how this will be used when it's placed on an agent not separately on its own. So just to recap, the blur circle size effectively encodes the depth of the scene or how far some object is. Can we utilize this? And can you come up with thoughts or examples which actually can do this? I would urge you to pause the video for a second and go through this thought experiment with me. Great. Let me give you an example. Imagine your goal on an aerial robot is to dodge obstacles at some distance, right? And this distance, of course, varies with how fast you go, how big is your robot, how fast you can turn, and all these things. Let's leave all that aside for now. Let's say for a given robot, for the speed we are trying to go, let's say 2 meters per second, we want to dodge trees which are at 1 meter away, right? If you don't dodge it at a meter, you are going to basically hit it. That's essentially what I'm saying. So this paper, which we wrote in VACWI with my students, essentially asks the question, do you really need to estimate full depth to do that? The spoiler alert answer is no. You actually don't need explicit depth. You don't need to estimate the depth of the scene to know, hey, something is at 1 meter. All we need to know is like a binary function which says there is something at 1 meter or there is nothing at 1 meter. And we keep going, right? And that's the easy way to do it. To do that, remember, blur sort of encodes depth. If there was a magical way for us to estimate how blurry something is, the moment something gets sharp, if we focus at 1, we know that something is at 1 and we really want to dodge it. And that's how you can encode depth without explicitly getting depth, right? So we utilize this beautiful camera called an event camera. I would urge you to subscribe to the channel for a future episode on event cameras because they're beautiful sensors. Event cameras work like our eyes, which detect motion. Like at night, you're hypersensitive to motion, but you lose color. Event cameras work the same way. As you move something around in the scene, you will basically see these pixels highlight that there is motion, but there is no intensity information. There is no RGB color here, right? So we basically set focus at distance of 1 meter. And if we start moving and there is something really sharp there, we basically get a lot of events there. And when something is blurred out, we get lesser number of events. I would urge you to read the paper for more technical details, but that's the intuition here. So what we will do then is, we essentially are going to measure how sharp this event data is, which is if you have an image which is sharp at 1 meter, you know that there's something at 1 meter. If it's far away, it's blurred out, right? And that's what we are trying to do. So what you'll see on the left here is, on the left bottom, you will see the raw event data, which is converted into image frames. On the bottom left, on the right hand side, the black and white image, you're actually seeing the sharpness map. The whiter the pixels, the sharper something is. If we see a big blob of white, we are basically going to invoke a dodging maneuver. And you'll see the aerial robot flying through trees here. And remember, we have set the focus at about 1 meter. And you will see that as we get closer to a tree, in this particular case, it gets sharp and like you see the tree and you start dodging it. That's basically what we did here. Beautiful. To quickly recap about everything we talked about till now, if you have a really small aperture mated with the thin Gaussian lens law, we can approximate this mathematically with what is called a pinhole model. Great. So let's write that in equations. Let's write that in math. Remember, I promised that this video is all about math. So let's dive right into the math. Okay. Remember our camera Obscura example. This is exactly the same thing, but with a sensor. So we have a pinhole. Remember that this pinhole is essentially the Gaussian lens thin Gaussian law approximated with a pinhole. You have the imaging sensor on the back here, and you have the Gompe, the object, the goat, in the front. So you have a world point in capital XYZ, and you basically have the image sensor at the focal distance to the pinhole. Remember, we found this by like focusing rays from infinity, and that's how we know the focal length. And this pinhole is approximating the big complicated lens we have in our cameras, but we are going to just approximate it with a pinhole. We have the focal length in meters. I'm going to call it as F subscript M. So because the imaging sensor is in the back, it's actually minus FM. And I want you to keep attention to these like pluses and minus signs because they're super important as things will flip around. Okay. Okay, let's continue this. And the rays of light are the same as before. Instead of it being in 2D, like we were seeing with the lens example, it's in 3D right now. Okay, great. So of course the similar triangles are going to be in the horizontal plane in 3D here. So you have like the triangle which correlates with the pinhole, the object, and the optical ray, which is the red color ray which passes through the center of the pinhole, to the center of the sensor itself towards the object. And the triangle on the other side, which is like the image, the pinhole, and the optical ray, they are going to be similar triangles to each other. So we are going to, the angle subtended is the same. So we are going to use the similar triangle law and write a simple similarity equation here. So here UCCD basically refers to the number of the physical meters or millimeter scale on the sensor, how far that 3D world point gets imaged. See the red point on the right hand side, which is the world point, and the red point on the imaging sensor. We are talking about those 2 points, right? And it's going to be scaled appropriately with the focal length in meter f into tan theta, where tan theta is given by the ratio of how far this point is x by z for the x side of the triangle. For the y side of the triangle, it's going to be y by z, and that's going to be called as VCCD. CCD here refers to charge coupled device, which are these olden days imaging sensors. I'm just sticking to that convention because that's what is used in a lot of textbooks. So if you go back from this video and read something in a textbook, you sort of know how to correlate the same thing. So essentially what we have done is we have said how the world point ray actually falls onto the imaging sensor, and we have written the similarity equation between the 2 triangles. So this equation essentially gives you the projection of the 3D point onto the CCD plane or the image sensor plane or the analog image sensor. So the word XYZ point gets mapped into U and VCCD in this particular manner, right? Which is scaled by this focal length, and it's the ratio of X and Y to the specific corresponding depth. Remember that here depth is a scaling factor, and you're going from a 3D world like this Gompe statue to a 2D image plane, and that's why you have the ratios. So you essentially lose depth when you actually image something, which makes sense because you go from a 3D to a flat 2D image, right? And that's what we're talking about here. Great. So what we are going to do is, for mathematical convenience, I don't really like writing this negative sign in the previous slide. I'm just going to show this one more time. I don't like writing this negative minus FM every single time. So I'm going to just say, I'm going to imagine a virtual image plane, or a projection plane is what it's called in computer vision and robotics. I'm going to just flip the entire sensor around. I also want you to notice that the image which is formed on the back of the pinhole is flipped upside down, right? I'm going to flip the entire thing right side up and put it in front of the pinhole at the same distance of FM, and I'm going to just flip all the negative signs to positive. From now on, whenever you see a positive sign, you're actually talking about this virtual image plane, not the physical sensor plane, right? I just wanted to keep that in mind. Beautiful. So now we have this beautiful projection equation with a positive F. Life is easy. We don't have to write this negative sign every single time. So let's zoom in more into this image plane, and we are trying to do this in metric space, right? Remember, we said that we are doing this in millimeters, but we want to go from the CCD plane to the image plane, where we are talking about pixels. We don't really care about, hey, how many millimeters on the sensor is it falling, right? We don't really care about that. We say, okay, this point from the world at 100 meters is imaged onto 20 by 20 pixels, and that's what we care about, right? So we want to do a conversion of meters to pixels. So to do that, we need the size of the physical sensor itself. So I'm going to call it the H of CCD and W of CCD, and I'm going to call a point on the image in pixels as U image and V image, and the point on the sensor, which is in millimeters, remember, it's going to be U and V CCD from the back previous slides. Camera sensors can vary quite a lot. They are different kinds of sensors. The 35mm full frame camera is the most standard, and it's set to be a crop factor of 1. The idea is that this is the same size as the analog film, and that's why we have picked that number. Anything that is smaller than that, we have a crop factor greater than 1. So the higher the crop factor, the smaller the sensor size. Your smartphone sensors are about 1 by 2.3 inches or like 1 by 1.7 inches, and you'll see that the crop factor is like 5.62 or 4.55, so it's pretty small. And you can actually have cameras which are bigger than full frame, right? Like these super expensive cameras called the medium format cameras have a crop factor of half, which means that they're double the image, the sensor size of the full frame camera. So these come in. These are pretty important for you to know because these are standard sizes, because the manufacturers make cameras in these standard sizes. Okay. So remember that we essentially had a projection of a pinhole, and we did all the math in millimeter space on the imaging sensor, but now we want to convert all of that into pixels. So just to recap, we have the height and width of the sensor in millimeters, and then we have height and width of the image in pixels. This is where the resolution of your image comes in. If you have a 1920 by 1080 image like the video you're watching right now, your height is going to be 1080 and your width is going to be 1920. This is in pixels, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to convert this U and V in millimeter space, which is CCD on the left hand side, to that in the pixel space, which is on the right hand side. Okay, great. So we are going to denote the center of the sensor as 0, 0 because it makes the math a lot nicer. And the equivalent of that in the image, which is the image center, we are going to denote this as the image principal point px and py. Remember that px and py depend on the resolution of the image. So if it's a 1920 by 1080, it's going to be half of those two values, right? But of course, it's still at the center of the image. So we are going to denote in the image plane the top left corner as 0, 0. And this sort of is more of a convenience because when you represent this in the computer, you actually want to index the array this way. So it's just more of a convenience. You could have chosen the center as 0, 0, but then you would have like negative indexes, which is harder and painful to like write in equations. And that's why we do that. Okay, great. So let's dive right in. Let's write the equations for conversion from the metric space on the CCD sensor in millimeters to the pixel space on the image plane. That's fairly simple. It's just a simple shift and a scale, and that's what we would have. So the amount of pixels U image is basically the physical millimeter space U CCD multiplied by this ratio of width of the image in pixels to the width of the physical sensor in millimeters plus the image shift of principal point in pixels. You can do the exact same thing for V, which is for Y, and you're going to replace all the W's with H and PX with PY. So essentially what we have done, just to quickly recap, we have the world point, capital XYZ. It gets impinged through this pinhole onto this image sensor, right? And we have flipped this for the virtual image plane, and that virtual image plane is UCCD and VCCD. But then that is in millimeter space. We want to go from that millimeter space with a scale and a shift operation to the pixel space. So step 1 is we do metric projection. We basically go from capital XYZ, we take the ray and we basically squash down the depth. Remember, we lose depth when we go from 3D to 2D, and that's what we do here. And this U and V CCD are in millimeter space. But we don't really care too much about that. We want to put this in pixels because we want to be agnostic somewhere to the sensor size and agnostic to the and dependent more on the resolution because that's what is represented on the computer. And that is a scale and a shift operation done this way. So this ratio of W image to WCCD or H image to HCCD is also called the pixel pitch. It's basically the number of pixels in the physical unit of millimeters. So this is where your actual size of the pixel actually comes in from this set of equations. So we did the metric projection, world, we squashed down depth, we lost depth, and we got millimeters in the image plane. We flipped it to the virtual image plane to make minus f to plus f. And then we basically scaled and shifted it to the principal point so that it's easy to index. And this is called the pixel projection. Now U image and V image are what are the pixels you identify in your image. You say 100 by 100 pixels, and that's what we're talking about here. So just a quick recap from one of the previous slides. If you haven't watched the video on imaging sensors, I would highly urge you to watch it, because this all becomes very intuitive after you have watched that. So as you zoom in, your field of view reduces. So which means that as your focal length increases, which is you're zooming in, your field of view drops, your value of u and v go up, which makes sense, because if you zoom in, your object in the world is going to occupy a bigger space in the same image frame, right? And like that's what zooming in means, and that's what we just talked about. So zooming in helps you make some cool things like forced perspective. We know that humans in this particular image are of course of similar size, and the person in front is not like 5 or 6 times larger than the people in the back. The people in the back get compressed more, because remember we had x by z ratio and y by z ratio, and so that's what you're seeing. As you push up the z, the number of pixels occupied by that object is small in the image, and that's what we have done here. So which makes you get this perspective that these people are actually super small, right? And that's what, when we started this entire video journey together, we said, hey, why do you pick one of the paintings over the other? Because the perspective made sense. And that is what we are talking about through math in this case. So this also lets you do some really cool stuff in the movies. So this effect is called the dolly zoom effect, which you might have seen in a lot of famous movies. So that will happen anytime now. Yeah, so that's the dolly zoom effect, which sort of gives you an illusion of warping space. It's a very cool effect, and it's used creatively in a lot of top-notch movies and even like animated movies. Beautiful. So what's essentially happening is, in this particular case, you have objects in the scene with different depths. As you are like moving towards or away from the subject, which are these objects, you try to zoom in the opposite direction. If you're going closer, if you're going closer to the objects, you basically zoom out. If you're going farther away, you zoom in, right? And this is basically like a dolly, wherein you have like a slider where you move the camera. This shot creates a sense of unease in the viewer, because it sort of simulates a spatial warp, but it's messing with your head of space and time, and it can either shrink or extend distances based on the choice of the direction. Beautiful. So remember, we have done all this. We talked about perspective. The question is, can you get depth from a single image? Let's take this image for example. This is a person sitting on a salt flat with their car. So the person in this image is of height 410 pixels, and the height of the image is about 720 pixels. Given that we know the focal length of the camera, because we got it from the EXIF information, because we know what image we took from what camera, which is 50 millimeters, and knowing the actual height of the person, which is 910 millimeters, can we estimate how far the camera was from that person, right? So the answer is no, you can't really get this directly. And I want you to pause and ponder for a second why you can't get that. You can't get that because I still haven't told you what is the size of the sensor. Because you remember that you need the pixel pitch, because you only have pixels, you need the mapping to go back to meters. So you need the size of the sensor as well. Just the focal length is not enough. So to get that, so because we took the photo from the camera, we know the size of the sensor as well. So we can plug all these equations back into what we just saw, and you can estimate that this image was taken from the person at about 2.08 meters away, which is super duper accurate. Can you use this newly found superpower to like backtrack where people took photos in front of the monument? Because you might want to take a similar picture. Let's do a similar setup as we saw before. You know the focal length is 50 millimeters. You know the height of the person is 1.7 meter. You know the height of the Taj Mahal as 73 meters. How far did we take the picture from? Right? Same as before, knowing all these values from before of the sensor size and everything, we plug it in. we know that the person was about 3.89 meters away. So how far was the camera from the Taj Mahal? Because I want to pinpoint this location on Google Maps. The answer is, if you do the same math, 167.43 meters. Is this actually correct? Let's go back to Google Maps and look at it. Let's draw circles around Taj Mahal, and exactly at 167 meters, if I go and look at Google Street View images, you get this image of the Great Gate, which is exactly where this person took this photograph. So we are super duper accurate. Please do not use these superpower skills to stalk your ex or stalk somebody else. Stalking is definitely not good. But you can actually utilize this in a robotics context to really localize where you are with respect to the world if you're completely lost. Another cool fact is that with the new Google Maps update, if the GPS is not working really well, you can point the phone up and so that the camera looks at visual features and sort of maps to estimate where you are. It uses fundamentally the same math we are doing here, but of course in a more fancier deep learning context, which we will see in one of the later videos. So please subscribe to be in tune for that. Okay, let's recap again. You have a world point, capital XYZ. You do the first step, which is metric projection. You lose depth when you squash down 3D to a 2D image. But now the U and V values are in millimeters, which is not that great for us. We want it to be in pixels so we can manipulate the images. So what we do next is we use the pixel pitch, which is how wide each pixel is in width and height, and the shift with respect to the principal point to actually do the metric U CCD V CCD to U image and V image, which is in pixel space, which is the pixel projection. So the two steps to recap are metric projection, where you lose depth, and then pixel projection, where you go from millimeters to pixel scale. So this is where we are. So this, like I said before, is the pixel density, and I'm going to call this pixel density as focal length in pixels. Till now we have seen FM, which is focal length in millimeters, but in this particular case I'm going to combine these values of all these things to call it focal length in pixels. Okay, so focal length in pixels is given by focal length in millimeters into the pixel density itself. Of course, you can have a different focal length for X and Y. Generally, if the pixel density is the same, you would assume that Fx and Fy are the same, and you would call that F. The question is, when will Fx not be equal to Fy? So when Fx is equal to Fy, we are assuming that the pixels are square, the pixel density is the same. So you would essentially have them same. When you have non-square pixels, Fx and Fy can change. Again, remember this depends more on the pixel density, not necessarily on just the shape of the pixels itself, right? I'm just giving you an example here. Okay, great. So now let's move on to our new equations, which is basically you have U image, V image. We have our beautiful newfound focal length in pixels. F, we assume they are same in this case, but you can put Fx and Fy just to follow along. And what we can do in this case is we can multiply through and through by Z, and this is the equation we are going to get. And in these videos, we love math a lot. So we want to write these things as beautiful linear algebra equations so we can actually solve this as least squares in the future videos. So what we are going to do is we are going to basically homogenize this equation. We are going to add a dummy 1. This 1 represents the fact that we are imaging at the focal plane. So the pixels are always in focus. That 1 represents that it's one focal length. It's normalized by the focal length. So that's what that 1 means, right? And so we have this Z sticking out, which we don't know. Remember, we have lost this value. And then we put this into a nice, beautiful equation. And since we don't know what the Z is, which is some object can be like twice the distance away and twice the height. In your pixel space, it will look exactly the same if it was half the distance away and half the height. Imagine a 1 meter high object 1 meter away. That will look exactly the same as a 2 meter high object which is 2 meters away, which makes sense, right? And that's how we were playing with this force perspective, which we were flipping the problem script around. So this Z, technically you will never know from a single view without much knowledge, without given enough priors, right? So I'm going to just call this an unknown variable or an unknown scale factor lambda in red. Okay. So in computer graphics, what we do is we basically go from the world to the image, because we are simulating, we have the 3D structure of the scene. We are simulating how the rays would intersect and it would give us an image. That's what we are doing here, right? Computer vision would basically be the inverse of graphics, which is we have the image and we are trying to use this image to go into the world space to get the three-dimensional structure of the world, which we are going to see in the later set of videos, where we are going to use this to do simultaneous localization on mapping, or SLAM, and how we can actually reconstruct the world given a few of these images. Okay, so remember that this matrix which we are like putting around with the focal length and the principal points is an upper triangular matrix, and you'll have beautiful properties with this upper triangular matrix which we are going to use in the future videos. Okay, so just to recap again, so we had the world point, we squashed down the depth, we did the metric projection, and then we took the metric projection, we used this pixel pitch and this focal length in pixels to go back to pixel space, and that's what we have done. These are the two steps. We are gonna, and remember that we did not know depth Z, because like it's the scale of the object is gone, so we replace that with a lambda. We are left with this beautiful pinhole projection equation. So in this pinhole projection equation, this matrix which combines your pixels to the metric space is called the camera calibration matrix K. So this camera calibration matrix essentially captures two things. It captures all the properties of your lens, which is the focal length, how much it zooms in, how it bends light and all that, and the pixel density and the pixel shape in your sensor, right? How many pixels there are, what kind of pixels, all these stuffs are basically combined into this one equation called the camera projection equation, and in this one entity called the camera calibration or intrinsic matrix K. Okay, so just a little more math. Remember that we said that you have a world point XYZ which was imaged. You can take this equation of the pinhole projection equation, flip this around, which is basically take this K, because we know K is invertible, you will invert K, and you will be left with this equation which gives you an equation of a 3D ray. This 3D ray essentially is denoting this point. What would have happened, it's the ray which intersects the center of your image to this world point. Okay, this is what it would look like, and that's the 3D ray. And we know that every point in the world has a ray associated with it, and this is what is called a ray endpoint duality. When you write these set of equations, they can be used interchangeably, and we are going to utilize this mathematical trick and notion in the future to write a bunch of super cool math. So just to recap, when we invert the pinhole projection equation, which is this equation you see on the top, it's lambda into uv1 into this like giant matrix which we call K into xyz. You invert K and that becomes a 3D ray. So this world point xyz is essentially the equivalent of a 3D ray from the center of your image plane, right? Again, this is very clear in this case, wherein you can have any number of points on this ray and they would all give you the same set of equations, which is twice the distance far away, twice the object height, same thing, right? Beautiful. So, and that's just to recap, the 2D point is equal to the 3D ray. The 3D point lies on the 3D ray passing through the origin and the 2D point. In this particular case, the origin is the center of the imaging sensor. Remember that. In other words, any 2D point can be represented as a 3D ray, and any 3D ray will become a 2D point. Okay, till now it was very convenient, life is easy peasy, because we were working in the image land and we never need to talk about coordinate frames. Remember that when you try to put this on a robot, remember it's embodied, you have to put it on a robot, you might place the camera in a slightly different position than your friend. So you need to talk about coordinate frames, because when you have multiple of these guys, your camera coordinate frames become a big deal, right? It becomes a big pain if it's not handled carefully. So we have three things here. We have the object world, which is the world coordinates W. You have the camera coordinates in your pinhole virtual image, remember? And we have the image plane, which is the image coordinates in pixel space. So you have the blue thing, which is world coordinates, you have the red thing, which is camera coordinates, and you have the image coordinates, which is the orange thing. And depending on the way I have denoted these arrows, the red, green, and blue represent X, Y, and Z respectively. And remember we said that scene depth was Z. The reason scene depth was Z is because of the coordinate system we have chosen here. And it's to be consistent with all of the literature. And this is exactly the reason why camera is represented as an imaging frustum. This point on the back represents your imaging center, and this frustum plane in the front represents your image plane. And these are basically the rays which are in between them. And that's why it's that shape. So when we go from camera coordinates to the image coordinates, we basically go from XC, YC, ZC to XI, YI image. But what we want to do is essentially go from the world to the camera, which is capital XYZ to small XYZ. So the goal was that. So it's fairly simple. We want to basically go from world to camera, which is, remember, the metric projection, and then camera to image, which is basically the perspective projection or your metric scaling, remember. Okay. So to do that, we are going to write the coordinate transformations between the two. So the camera coordinates XC is given as a rotation and translation of the world coordinates XW, which makes sense. It's a simple coordinate transformation. And if you don't know how coordinate transformations are done, I will have a future video coming up on the basics of transformation, so stay tuned for that. But now you can take my word for it. It's fairly simple. So what you do is you rotate and then translate, and that's how we got there. So this is the world to camera coordinate transformation. And remember that if you flip the coordinate system, you can also write it this way, which is exactly the flipped version. In this case here, you translate and then rotate. You can also do this. C in this case is the camera location as seen from the world. Depending on what reference source you are looking at, you will either look at the one on the left or you will look at one on the right. Some of them are a little easier to optimize, so people like interchangeably use either of them. But remember that there is a beautiful one-to-one mapping between the two. Okay. So remember our pinhole projection equation, which is lambda uv1 into k matrix into x, y, and z c in the camera coordinate system. This was our k. And we will plug in basically the equation from the top, which is world to camera coordinate system, into this pinhole projection equation, right? So this is camera projection of the world point. So this is our final camera projection pinhole equation model, which is lambda uv1 into this giant matrix which we call k into the rotation and translation between the world point and the camera coordinate system and the world point xyz1. This k is called the camera intrinsics. These R and T, the relative transformations, are called the camera extrinsics matrix. So in literature, a lot of times what people will do is they will combine K and R and T into one matrix. They will call the projection matrix or P. So what you can do, just like we saw before, you can invert this projection matrix P to get the 3D ray again, right? And this is the same 3D ray direction we saw before, again just with the extrinsic calibration coordinates involved. So we have the 3D ray direction. The 3D ray origin in this particular case becomes the camera center, which is the translation of the camera center in the real world. Here C is the camera center or the translation vector in the real world. Okay. So remember that we defined Z to be this way, which means that all the world points are in front of the camera for it to be imaged. Of course, which makes sense because your sensor cannot see behind the camera, right? So it only sees in front. So Z is always positive. So lambda, which is our scale factor, has to be positive. This is called the chirality constraint or the depth positivity constraint. Remember that this was one projection model But you can have definitely other camera models as well, where you change the equation. This is what we had with the strong perspective, which is the perspective projection equation, or the pinhole model for the perspective projection equation, right? This is what we had. It's a perspective camera model. But you can change the equation in this way, wherein you have something called the weak perspective, wherein like the difference between the multiple object depths is not very apparent, so they look similar. And you would basically like add additional constraints to this projection equation, where you zeroed out the bottom row here, right? So this is basically called the affine camera model. And I want you to pause the video for a second and think where you might have used both perspective and affine camera model views. If you have ever used a 3D program like CAD or something else, you would have used this button called perspective and orthographic, which basically gives you the projection model, the full projection model with the perspective view, and the orthographic model where like you do the affine projection on the right hand side. To quickly recap, we basically studied about a camera model today, where you basically have this like lens configuration called the intrinsic parameter, which we have neglected for now. We have assumed that the lens is perfect, which we'll talk about in a future episode. Stay tuned. And we talked about the spatial relationship between the sensor and the bending power of the lens. This is called the intrinsic parameter, the sensor plus the lens combination. This L is basically the distortion effects and like the light ray bending, which we haven't talked about. And then we did talk about the camera body configuration, the extrinsic parameter, how the relative orientation of the camera is with respect to the word point. So for a quick understanding check, how do you focus a camera? Does your high school optics equation still hold true for a camera which is complicated? What are camera intrinsics? What are camera extrinsics? Does the camera equation depend on the sensor size? Why or why not? What is the difference between orthographic and perspective projection? Can you get depth from a single image? I know this episode was large, but it's extremely fundamental to all the videos we are going to cover in the future. Thank you for staying along this long. See you on the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.